Former CIA Director David Petraeus has said that if Russia were to carry out a nuclear attack in Ukraine, the United States and its allies would likely respond by destroying Russian forces in Ukraine and possibly in the Black Sea. Petraeus, a retired U.S. Army general, made the comments at a security conference in Poland, but stressed that he was speaking about hypothetical scenarios.
Said, again, there's a number of responses. The one that I pointed out as a possibility, and it's only a possibility, a hypothetical, would be that this would be where the U.S. and presumably other countries, whether it would be NATO or collective, it's hard to say, could take action within Ukraine, perhaps, in a way that would actually make Russia's situation even worse. In other words, to take out with conventional forces many of the Russian capabilities that still exist in Ukraine and perhaps even on the Black Sea. So it would make this disastrous situation even more dire for Russia.
Well, for more on Ukraine's counter-offensive and Russia's threat of using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, let's speak to the U.S. military analyst Doug Brooks, who joins us from Washington, D.C. Great to see you, Doug. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's start with the battle front. Beyond the east, where it's already making big advances, Ukrainian troops now reportedly making significant progress in the south as well. What are you hearing about that?
Yeah, they've been running quite quickly, actually astonishingly quickly, and the Russian military units have essentially broken for the most part and fled to the sort of major settlements and cities. They don't seem to be putting up much resistance at all at this point. So it looks like probably in a day or so they should be at Kherson. What will happen next is anybody's guess, but I don't see the Russians putting up much of a fight anymore.
And this news, Doug, of Ukrainian gains comes as reports suggest that a military convoy attached to forces responsible for Russia's nuclear arsenal has been spotted heading towards Ukraine. Are we able to verify what's going on there? Because, I mean, twice recently, President Putin said he was not bluffing when he said Russia was prepared to use nuclear weapons to protect its territory.
Well, if they're moving it towards Ukraine, that would imply it's a tactical nuclear weapon, which, again, there's just a nuclear threshold that nobody wants to see Russia cross. And I think Petraeus made a really good point that essentially the biggest penalty for using a nuclear weapon, even a tactical and a smaller one, would be that NATO essentially would take pretty drastic action to make sure that Ukraine wins this war and Russia loses. And I think that's sort of the exact opposite of what Putin is trying to do here. So the consequences are pretty dire, even if they just use a single, tactical nuclear weapon. If they do something larger, of course, it'd be much, much more horrific.
Well, I mean, you know more about these things than we do. You talked about tactical nuclear weapons. So we're talking about nuclear weapons that are slightly smaller, from what I've read, than the ones launched against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So in that regard, small is a terrible misnomer, isn't it? Because it would still wreak enormous devastation.
It's still a nuclear weapon. There's still radioactive fallout that, if they're going to use it in Ukraine, probably some of that fallout's going to end up in Russia as well. Although there is low yield nuclear weapons. Nevertheless, the weapon isn't even that tactical use of such a weapon isn't even that useful unless you have concentrated forces that you're shooting it at. And the whole conflict here is really quite dispersed. So it's the actual military value of a tactical nuclear weapon is really limited in this case, even if that's the goal. So they've been bluffing about nuclear weapons, and there's been a lot of bravado from the Russians saying, if NATO gets involved, we're going to use nuclear weapons. If Crimea becomes under threat, we're going to use nuclear weapons. I mean, they keep saying that, and from a strategic perspective, it just doesn't make any sense. And the potential drawbacks of using a nuclear weapon and the greater involvement of NATO and the US and everything, it just doesn't make any sense. Well, the invasion of Ukraine didn't make any sense, so don't hold your breath. It's a scary moment.
Well, actually, that's a very good point you make. But even if all this is just about posturing, I mean, is there the risk of unintended escalation where something happens, people respond, and that spirals out of control? In other words, everyone escalates with the intention of getting the other party to back down, and that's how you get the spiral.
You're absolutely correct. It's a very harrowing time, but the reality is that Putin has backed himself in a corner on this one. He made some, back in February, he was hoping to take Ukraine in a few days and basically replace it with his own government, and that failed spectacularly. And now he's about to lose the gains he had from 2014. So his army is basically failing. His call up for additional troops is failing. He's running out of options right now, and it's for an authoritarian like him, that's really bad news. He has people out there that don't want him to, within his own government, that don't want him to be the leader anymore. So he's got to be worried about it. And right now, the only support he has is coming from his hard right and the people that are advocating for nuclear weapons and so on. That's a very small group. And I think a lot of Russians most Russians probably have lost confidence in this guy already. It's not a democratic system, so it's not like he can be voted out, but what other options are there?
Well, I mean, in a perverse sort of way, that's precisely the worry, isn't it? That all of this, as you said, tied into the picture on the battlefield, Ukraine seeming to make gains, not just in the east, but also in the south, apparent dissent at home. I mean, all that increases pressure on President Putin, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, he's definitely not having a good week, a good month, or a good year. He's in trouble, and we'll have to see what happens. I think more and more analysts are coming to the conclusion that he will not be able to maintain his control over the Russian government. And what happens next? I mean, it's scary for Russia. It's scary for the whole world because, as you pointed out, I mean, there's a lot of nuclear weapons sitting there.
And I wonder if all that means that this conflict is likely to last many years. That's a question we will have to leave for another day. Doug, I want to thank you very much indeed. Doug Brooks is a U.S. military analyst, and he was talking to me there from Washington, D.C.